discussion of the Reformation in various aspects. Particularly now we're talking about things that went on in England, because they had a direct impact on America and the development of Christianity in America. So I want to cover some things now that we're moving from the time of the Reformation forward, and we're getting into some stuff that's going to have more direct impact on American Christianity. First, I want to talk to you about Puritanism. Edward VI, who was the son of Henry VIII and this woman named Jane Seymour, was, when he, as I mentioned in an earlier video, when he became king, he was knowledgeable about theological things. And he was interested in taking the Church of England toward Protestantism. Remember, Henry was really a devout Catholic. He wasn't interested in the theology of the Reformers. He just needed to break with the Roman Catholic Church so he could annul his marriage to Catherine of Aragon. But this son of his, Edward VI, he was more knowledgeable about the theological aspects of Reformation, and theological teachings had been crossing back and forth between England and the continent. Wycliffe's writings had been read on the continent. Men like John Huss read the writings of Wycliffe. That's why Wycliffe's called the morning star of the Reformation. So, Reformed ideas, criticisms of the Roman Catholic Church, calls for reformation of the Roman Catholic Church have been going on both in the continent, on the continent, and in England. And so there were people in England with Reformed ideas, and Edward VI had heard of these things, and so he was allowing some of these Reformed-minded leaders to influence developments of Christianity in the Church of England and so forth. But unfortunately, Edward VI died after a very short time. He was ill. And so his half-sister, Bloody Mary, who was the daughter of Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon, she was able to wrangle it about, and she took over. And she was a devout Catholic. Remember, her mother's a Spaniard, and Spain was the bastion of Catholicism. She wanted to lead England back to Catholicism, so she executed some 300 Protestant-leaning clerics. And that's why she's called Bloody Mary. It's interesting, I was in the church in Oxford, England, where the university is. There's the Church of Mary, I think it's called, in Oxford, and I was reading plaques they have on the walls there, and it's just amazing and horrifying that when the church went toward Protestantism, they persecuted those who said, no, we're not going to do it, like Thomas More, who said we're Catholic, and they wanted to stay with that. And then when Bloody Mary came in and said we're going back to Catholicism, they persecuted people who said, no, we're seeing these new ideas, these Reformed ideas, and we want to go this way. They persecuted them. And right there at that same church, there were people from both sides who were burned at the stake right out front. It was pretty shocking, you know. I thought to myself, I'm glad I'm a pastor now in America. I don't think I'd want to be a pastor back then, because maybe, you know, you get a new president and he doesn't like your kind, and you're burned at the stake. But anyway, Bloody Mary, you know, she killed over some 300 Protestant-leaning clerics. But then she died and was succeeded by Elizabeth I, who was the daughter of Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn. Since, as I said last time, the RCC, the Roman Catholic Church, had already excommunicated Henry, and then they declared Elizabeth illegitimate, as I said before, she couldn't steer England back into the Roman Catholic fold, because then she would be illegitimate and she wouldn't be allowed to be the queen. So because of that, she had to allow Protestantism to continue for political reasons, right? And this made it possible for the so-called Marian exiles, people that had been exiled under Mary, who had fled for their lives under Mary and had gone to, many of them had gone to Geneva, Switzerland, to be with Calvin and the reformers there. But these exiles, when Elizabeth came and took over, these Marian exiles could return. So they came back from Geneva, Switzerland, where they learned so much at the feet of men like John Calvin. And they had developed their Protestant views, their Reformed views, and gotten stronger in them. So they came back to England, and they brought their Calvinistic influence with them. One of the guys who had a tremendous impact was Martin Butzer. He ended up being invited to Oxford, and he came, and he actually wrote a book to the King of England explaining what the duties of a Christian monarch were and so forth. And so it's pretty interesting. These Protestants came, so there's this influence coming in, this Calvinistic influence. Now, Elizabeth had a tough row to hoe as the queen, because she wanted to keep England unified, of course. And, you know, Europe had been torn apart by these religious wars and all this fighting over doctrine and stuff. So she didn't want that to happen in her kingdom. She wanted them to be unified. And she recognized that the bulk of the population was still Catholic at heart. I've taken over a church here as pastor in Florida, where in Beverly Hills, Florida, where the people were used to very traditional ways, and I'm more contemporary. And boy, it's really opened my eyes to how people are they have traditions and ways that they're used to, and it just really offends and upsets folks when you try to change things. And it really, takes a lot of time, and the truth is, everybody doesn't ever come on board. They just don't all come on board, and that's the way it was. The population was still Catholic at heart, but many of the prominent people, the ruling class and the middle class, was Protestant, because Protestantism appealed to the middle class. It's more individualistic, you have more human individual rights and so forth. So Elizabeth had to deal with this. What she did is she appointed moderate Protestants as officials, and there were various legal acts I won't go into. The Parliament passed the 1559 Act of Supremacy, which revived many of the Reformation statutes of Henry VIII and Edward VI, and that gave her authority over all spiritual and temporal issues of the realm. But instead of being called the supreme head of the church, as Henry was, he called himself the supreme head of the church. Elizabeth didn't like that, and she just wanted to be called, the head of England, and she's had a different title for herself that was less offensive and less, didn't make her like a pope. And she insisted on retaining certain Catholic customs. So many of the more conservative and Calvinistic English people were dissatisfied with her the acts that she passed and so forth. The Elizabethan settlement, they said, this is no good, because you're retaining too much of Roman Catholicism. We don't want that. We want to reform. And so there were over 500 exiles who returned from Marian exile, and they came to be known as the Puritans. Why? Because they wanted to purify the Anglican Church, the Church of England. They wanted to purify it of all the, quote, vestiges of popery, unquote, that remained. You're still too Catholic. You got to get rid of this stuff. Let us do it. So they're called the Puritans. Now, the Jesuits, it's a Catholic order, very zealous Catholic order. They, of course, were against this kind of a notion, and they actually came up with plots to depose Elizabeth. And so that became known by the Queen, and the government ended up taking stern action against people for both sides of the religious divide. And they took action against people for both religious and political views as well. She had some 200 Roman Catholics executed for treason. So it was really, difficult. I mean, you can't imagine. Thank God in America we don't have church mixed with state like that. But this in England, you just can imagine. You had centuries of tradition, and then people trying to bring something new, and it just didn't fly very well. The government was Church of England, was Anglican, but Roman Catholics and Catholicism was still very strong, and the Puritans were very strong. Now, the Tudor dynasty was, started by Henry VII, and then, of course, Henry VIII, and then these various offspring of his. But the Tudor dynasty ended when James I, who was a Stuart, came in as king. And he began the Stuart dynasty. And, man, he had all kinds of problems. This King James, he had all kinds of problems. He battled with the Puritans. He didn't like them. He didn't like this. He didn't like that. He was kind of straddling the fence in many issues. But he's trying to bring unity. He did concede to the Puritans that there was a need for a new English translation of the Bible, and that's how we got the King James Version of the Bible. And it served English speakers for about 3 centuries. Many people still love the King James. So he conceded that, but actually he wasn't that Protestant in his ways. And by the way, that Bible, many people today fight about the King James Bible and they say it's the true Protestant Bible, but it's not, because the people who translated the King James Version were Catholics and Anglo-Catholics. They were not as Protestant as you might think. The Geneva Bible is far more truly a Protestant Bible. But anyway, the Puritans, they gained power, and they eventually took over the House of Commons. So then they contended with James and the Stuarts throughout their time. This is when the famous Guy Fawkes kind of rebellion took place, and you still see today people like in Hong Kong wearing these masks of Guy Fawkes, you know, the white mask with the little mustache. He led an attempt to assassinate the king and blow up Parliament. And so anyway, all this upheaval was going on, all these political and religious battles going on. After James came Charles I. He was Arminian, a different form from, instead of being Calvinistic, he was Arminian. And during his reign, he appointed a guy named William Laud as Archbishop of Canterbury, and he insisted on worship being regulated. It has to be a certain way. And as a result of that, some 20,000 Puritans left for the New World. And that's why we got the Puritans, and that's why we had, you know, the Massachusetts Bay Colony and all, and the Mayflower and all the stories that we know that form part of our heritage. Many, many Puritans fled or left because of all this resistance to Protestant ideas. And so then this Charles I, he became desperate for money, and he began to tax the country unfairly. And that's when a little-known Puritan named Oliver Cromwell rose up and turned out to be an excellent military leader. He led a group called the Roundheads because they wore their hair cut short, and he beat the Cavaliers, who were the Royalists. They captured the king, they executed him in 1649, and the whole nation came under Cromwell and Puritan control. So the Puritans actually took charge of the government. That's what people today are afraid of, the evangelicals taking over the government of America. But anyway, it actually happened in England. They took over, and for a period of from 1649 to 1660, the Puritans ruled, and that's called the Commonwealth era. And so this brought the whole nation under heavy Calvinistic Puritanism. After Cromwell died, Oliver Cromwell died, then Parliament brought back Charles II from exile, again, because Oliver Cromwell, he didn't run a good government. Apparently he was a good man, and he had good theology and so forth, but he didn't run a good government. Just because you're a Christian doesn't mean you know how to run a government, right? And so they brought back Charles II from exile in France. They persecuted the Puritans, and 2,000 clergymen lost their pulpits, 5,000 were jailed. Tories were Anglicans, Whigs were Puritans, and when the next King James II tried to restore Catholicism, the Tories and the Whigs united against him and offered the throne, get this, to William and Mary of Holland. That's why we have the College of William and Mary, right, here in the United States. They were from Holland, but yet they were offered the throne of England. Isn't that interesting? All these people were intermixed and so forth. You know, it's really not like we might think it would be. Anyway, William and Mary reigned, William did from 1689 to 1702. Mary didn't last as long. She died in 1694. But get this, the governmental theories of the time were influenced by John Locke. He's the philosopher, you know, who influenced them. And guess what? He influenced the Americans as well. Our government is heavily influenced by the philosophical ideas of John Locke. So anyway, it's just very interesting, all this stuff, background and all. And the Puritan movement began in the 16th century, but it reached its height in the 17th. Puritans tended to exclude from worship anything not found in Scripture. They didn't really produce any sort of original theology that was just their own, but what they did is just try to apply Protestant doctrine, Protestant theology to life. And at one time, I was actually going to buy an external hard drive that had over 800 books on it, written by Puritans. So apparently they got really deep into a lot of principles for life that I've been told surpass anything we have today in terms of, like, we tend to rely on psychology and such. They apparently relied more on the Word of God to deal with the problems of life, even emotional issues, marital issues, stuff like that. But anyway, they wanted to purify the Church of England from the influence of Catholicism and the papacy. They emphasized conversion, which anticipated something we're going to talk about next, which is the Pietist movement and the evangelical movement today. They believed in living a constantly disciplined life. The Puritans did. And that's why a lot of people today think of them as just, dressed in black and very dour and sour-faced, like they've been sucking on persimmons or something. And people think, Puritans, that's terrible. But actually, their teachings were very satisfactory for many in their day, and they were good Christians. Listen, they wrote this. They wrote, "Man's chief end is to glorify God and enjoy Him forever." That's the first first answer to the first question in the Westminster Shorter Catechism. And we hear, I don't know if you've heard it, but I've heard it a lot. What is the chief end of man? In other words, what are we here for? Why do we exist? Their answer, man's chief end is to glorify God and enjoy Him forever. I think that's beautiful. That's a tremendous end for us, a goal for us to live for. So they believed that joy was found in worship and a life of duty to God. They believed in the dignity of work and that you should view your work as worship. And when they overthrew the king under Cromwell's leadership, they couldn't agree on a form of government they wanted, which I said, and that resulted in Cromwell having to be kind of a military dictator, right? And so that was not good. But all their disagreements led to what was called the Westminster Assembly, which produced the Westminster Confession, which is a classic statement of Presbyterianism. It was put together by 121 Puritan ministers. They called them divines back then. But there was a major division in the assembly, resulting in a split between Congregationalists and Presbyterians. Presbyterians that's where we get our Republican ideas of government, whereas Congregationalists, the congregation kind of decides everything. But under Cromwell, churches were pastored by various kinds of leaders. There were Presbyterians, Baptists, and Independents, and even Jews were allowed to settle in England, but Roman Catholics and Unitarians were not granted freedom of religion. The Puritans eventually lost influence in England, but they were strong in the American colonies under leaders like John Winthrop and John Cotton. You may have heard of them. And they actually believed that God had allowed them to go to America to set up kind of, model communities, a city on a hill kind of thing, that would be able to kind of demonstrate to the people back in England and in Europe how things could be if God's people would obey Him. That was kind of why they came here. Isn't that something? To found our country on biblical principles. It's not a fairy tale or a myth or a legend. It's true. They really had that kind of mentality. They came here to seek religious freedom and to establish a country based on the Word of God. And of some very important Puritans. I've already mentioned John Cotton and John Winthrop, but also John Bunyan, a very well-known Puritan. He wrote Pilgrim's Progress. That's one of the most famous Christian books of all time. And another Puritan was John Milton, who wrote both Paradise Lost and Paradise Regained. So the Puritans is quite an important and interesting movement. Now, let me spend a little time on another group called the Separatists. The Puritans were those who, within the Anglican Church, they worked to purify it, right? They thought, we stay with the Church of England, but we're going to work to purify it. And so they're called the Puritans. Separatists, on the other hand, were Christians who, their viewpoint was, you know what? You can't purify this thing. It's too corrupt. It's built on a wrong foundation. The Church of England cannot be reformed at all. What has to be done is you have to separate out from the national church and we have to form our own groups. And so there were various groups of these separatists. One of those groups became the Baptists, which we have today. Baptists are a huge part of American Christianity. some people try to connect them with the Anabaptists, the radical reformers that we talked about earlier. There's sort of a foggy sort of link, but you shouldn't really think that Baptists come from the Anabaptists. It's really, they have different roots. The Baptists trace their beginnings to a pastor of English refugees named John Smith. He broke with the Church of England while he was at Cambridge, and then he fled to Amsterdam, Holland. And he came to believe in things like adult believers' baptism by immersion, which I still believe in. And that differentiated him and his followers from other separatists, because some separatists believed in infant baptism, just like the Anglicans, just like the Presbyterians. But later, this guy, John Smith, his assistant pastor, Thomas Helwys, he led a part of that Baptist group from Amsterdam in a return to England in 1611. They called themselves the General Baptists, and they were Arminian. Now, I haven't gone into that much, but the Arminians were the followers of Jacobus Arminius. They broke from the strictly Calvinist believers. So the General Baptists were Arminian, and then there was another group that called themselves the Particular Baptists because they were Calvinists. And together they fought, these Baptists did, with the Puritans under Cromwell. So Cromwell showed them a lot of favor, but then when he died, they lost their privileges and they had to join with the dissenters. See, they lost favor. This pendulum thing. And so Baptist churches were established in England, and then they were established in America, especially through the cooperation of Roger Williams, who was a Puritan minister in Rhode Island. But he granted them religious freedom to come over there. Now, another person who came out of Puritanism was Jacob Boehme. He was a German shoemaker, but he taught mystical theology, and it was very obscure, very difficult. And the reason I mention him is because, the church I took over in Texas had a pastor who went off the track somewhat, and he got into the teachings of Jacob Boehme. But also I mention him because one of Boehme's followers was a man named George Fox. Now, George Fox was raised in a strict Puritan home, but he later departed from that, and he went in search of, enlightenment. He wanted to find the true light and the truth, of God and the spiritual life and so forth. Some 3 years later, he came to rely on, quote, the inner light of the living Christ, unquote. And so he formed a group called the Friends, or the Quakers. So they believed in this power of the inner light, see? And that was the power of the Spirit. It was given to all. And in their view, everybody had the Spirit, and you didn't have to follow strict biblical interpretation. You could be led by the inner light. And so you didn't need any clergymen either. You didn't need any preachers amongst the Quakers, because what they would do is they would come together in their meetings and sit in a circle, and they would all wait on God to give them the message. They'd wait for the Spirit to inspire them, and they would shake and quake, and that's why they were called Quakers. So in the meeting, you wouldn't have a pastor who'd prepare a sermon like I do, and he'd come and bring it to you. No, you'd all just join together and worship the Lord and wait quietly, and then somebody would say, the Spirit has given me what to say, and he'd speak. And the Quakers were also known for pacifism. They were pacifists. They were known for promoting education. They were known for charities, works of charity, honesty in business, and toleration. Now, one of their most famous followers. I know you do, because that man's name was William Penn, and he was the founder of Pennsylvania. He was a Quaker. And he wanted to have a place where he could promote the teachings of Quakerism. By the way, around this same time, there was a revival movement within the Catholic Church. Remember, they had the Council of Trent and the Counter-Reformation and everything, but there were still revival movements going on within the Catholic Church. One of them was a movement called Jansenism. They were followers of a guy named Cornelius Jansen, who was a Flemish bishop. Flemish means from Belgium. So he was a Flemish bishop. And actually, a lot of his teachings were really similar to the teachings of Calvinism. And so it was really kind of like a new Reformation movement of a smaller group within the Roman Catholic Church still going on. It's still bubbling up. And the Catholic Church, when they became aware of them, they condemned them for their independent ways. And they condemned them, the Jansenists, because the Jansenists condemned the Catholic Church for its moral laxity and for not being biblical and stuff. So they butted heads. They even condemned the Jesuits and even Louis XIV of France. And so they spoke against immorality, and they spoke against corruption and so forth. And needless to say, that didn't make them a lot of friends. One of the most famous Jansenists was the scientist and philosopher Blaise Pascal. He was a great man, and so he was a Jansenist. So it's just something you should know. There were also the Quietists. This was a mystical Catholic group that was seeking union with God. You know, mysticism has always bubbled up in the Catholic Church and in other groups. I think a lot of charismatics are kind of mystical. The Jesuits condemned the founder of mysticism, who was a Spaniard by the name of Miguel de Molinos. They had him put in prison. But a famous Quietist that you should know about was Madame Guyon. She won a lot of converts, but she was eventually imprisoned. I don't know if you've ever heard of Watchman Nee, but I read about him, the famous Chinese Christian of the early 20th century. He studied under some of the works of Madame Guyon. Many people today who are into the deeper spiritual life have mentioned or studied Madame Guyon. So I'll just stop at that point. And in the next video, I'm going to talk to you about a movement called Pietism. We'll get to that in the next video.